Let's use our last, let's see, 12 or 15 minutes to address these 4 questions as a panel. And I would say the questions that are in the coming in from the audience also cover these. I want to make sure we have time to get to this last one around the challenges or barriers to managing or sharing data that are most urgent to address. But maybe we should hit on those first couple first briefly. And we've not heard in comments yet from John and Anna. Do you want to say anything about those first 2 questions?
John, do you want to start? Or?
Sure.
I think we covered them in our slides quite well.
I think you did too, but if you a sentence or 2 might be useful here just to remind people.
Sure.
I think in terms of the first question, what are researchers' current perceptions about the value of managing and sharing data? It really depends on the research community that they're coming from. So some researchers who come from a community where there is quite a bit of data reuse, or at least obvious cases where that would be advantageous, there's pretty clear perception of value about why this is important and why this is important to do well. And where in communities where there's so far less immediate kind of reuse by peers, at least, that might be less clear. In terms of the cost, I think we've covered this and several other people have covered this, where cost is certainly an issue, especially costs for working storage or storage. I think costs for archival storage and curation is not something that every researcher is thinking about yet, but they may think about that more as NIH and others have requirements related to that or suggestions related to that. Anna, do you have any?
Yeah, I think the one of the things I was going to add was to the first part about perceptions of value, was about whether researchers saw the value in their data being reused, which is quite project specific. And that seems like a culture shift about thinking that someone would want to reuse your data or could reuse your data, or that it would be helpful to provide data that was reusable. And I think the impact is quite tied to that, right? So being able to demonstrate value through data citations or something like that. And then the only other comment about the costs that I was going to add was just about, even when these are allowable costs in grants, there's still a finite number of resources. And that's true across the community as well, right? So it's true for researchers who are writing a grant and they may not want to spend their direct costs on these requirements. And so should they come from indirects? Should there be other resources that a funder provides directly? Should it come from institutional resources? Maybe there are institutional resources, but researchers are not aware of them. And similarly within the community, how is the whole community infrastructure made sustainable? Data repositories, the professionalization of data curators and data stewards, how do we make that sustainably funded for the long term?
Thank you. Okay, let's make sure we get to these last ones on the urgency of questions. And who haven't, Irina, we haven't heard from you on these last yet. Do you want to say something about the challenges or barriers you think are the most urgent to be addressed as the NIH moves forward on implementing these policies?
Were you asking me?
I was asking Professor Pasquetto.
Okay, I was just...
I think that, everything has been said so far, plus really finding the way to promote collaboration and effective data reuse and kind of like investing in the human factor of the whole process. What we have been discussing also in the chat.
Right, yes. There's a very active background chat going on between the presenters and the others on the panel. Let's see, Jan and Danny both want to say something about the challenges. Danny?
So I guess from the time when the Holdren memo was just being written, I started asking the question, how much do we think all of this is worth? So it goes to this issue of costs. If you tell me that we could spend 2 or 3% of the federal budget that normally goes to research on making data available for reuse, I think that sounds great. If you tell me it's 20% of the federal budget, I begin to wonder. If it's 30 or 40%, then I'm not sure how much it's worth it as opposed to generating new research. And I've really hardly seen an estimate of how much it would cost to do this as fully as we would like to imagine it could be done. Nor have I seen very many, there are a handful, but I've only seen very few studies of the kinds of benefits that one gets out of it. So I think more attention to those questions in a serious way is what I would love to see happening going forward.
Thank you. Jan.
Sure. Now this is getting interesting. Well, imagine if we started the journal industry today and not 300 years ago. What would we expect from a journal article or from a journal publication? Would we say it's great with some text and a figure here and there? Probably not, because things have changed over those 300 years. And now with technology, you can actually tell a lot more. So are we then going to say, no, we don't want to tell that? Because it doesn't matter. We'll just give it a top interpretation level here. I don't think that sounds very convincing. Also with regard to costs. Researchers take the costs they need to take. Publication costs, well, they can be expensive. Long list of costs. If there's a need for these other costs, there will be a possibility to find solutions. And there should be smart solutions, of course, that can be cost effective. So you can't really do it ineffective by letting a lot of people, let's say, building a lot of different infrastructures. Has to be coordinated in some way. But I think from the researcher point of view, they need to find a business model where they understand this is how to do it. This works efficiently. It makes sense. It makes my research transparent, trustworthy. And it increases the chances that it can be reused again in the future, and it increases my opportunities for collaborations and makes me a part of the existing world, which has a number of different opportunities than what we had decades ago with the classical journal articles.
Among the many questions coming into the chat is not only the explicit costs, but the various implicit costs of managing within the lab. I think another one that has not come up that is in the public questions is about advice to journals and journal editors and what is most urgent in the community in terms of guidance to journals or actions that journal editors should be taken.
I'll share an experience. The very early on when gene expression microarrays were starting to be used in research, this is in the late 90s, there was a group was formed that pushed journals to require that any publication with these technologies needed to be put into a public database, and they succeeded. And now it became one of the best data resources during the next 5-10 years. It has I think hundreds of thousands of data sets in them now. There's an American one, Geo, and a European one, Array Express, and I imagine there's other examples like that. But it was because the journals required data to be deposited there that was done. I don't think it would have happened otherwise.
Good. Let me ask then, if we nothing else on the journal point, one last concluding question, which is we have had many different definitions or scopes, implicit or otherwise, about what is meant by data reuse throughout this whole conversation. I think if the speakers could give us, say, a one-sentence definition of data reuse, that might be a really nice wrap-up to this session for us thinking about the values and costs.
Well,
believe-
my simple one is whenever the data is used for a purpose that wasn't the original one intended by the data generator.
Okay. So not the original one.
And my worry is that data reuse for not the original purpose brings up all sorts of moral and very much legal questions about when the data is about people.
Excellent.
I would say we have to differentiate between data, human data, and many other kinds of data, or completely anonymized human data. Very different from what we discussed and heard from Danny and Gorov. So I think we will have problems in giving one single answer, but there are certainly lots of foundational data that can be used in many different contexts, and it's extremely important that such data are shared. And the other aspect, the way I see it, is to really be able to combine data that are described in such a way that you can build on and extend and expand. Not also forget the huge modeling community, computational neuroscience community, for example, just to take my field, which are suffering from looking at text and tables, but can move on if they have access to something deeper.
Yeah, I would certainly, when talking about data reuse, expand from just reusing data or taking a look at data to draw new conclusions to applying new methods or adapting tools used on the data, even training people using the data. I think when we talk about reuse, the use part, there's a myriad of those.
Yeah, I would say that it's a very broad term, many flavors. We maybe need more words to describe the different flavors of data reuse going forward. But yeah, using it for training, incorporating into textbooks to make tools, to make workflows, and to not even classify it as reuse by others or reuse away from its original intent, but even just reuse within the same research group, right? One, common thing you say to someone you're teaching data management practices to is that the most common person who needs to reuse your data is you. And will you be able to do that in 10 years? So is reuse of a data set by the same research group for a different project considered reuse?
Gerda?
Yes, that definition makes sense. I think you all added the right characteristics of data reuse. I definitely consider it as reusing data for something else than the original purpose of the data. It could be definitely by the same team or by other teams. So I think that this definition kind of covers it. But yes, I just want to reiterate, it's very important to think about the different kinds of reuse, different purposes of reuse, because that changes things quite a bit.
Okay, we're approaching the end of our time. So let me just wrap up by saying that I think we've explored a wide range of topics with a very distinguished group of speakers. And even more, I think we've raised more questions and answered, which was exactly the point, is to show that we don't agree on what are data across these different disciplines, whether we're talking about something with just a couple of variables, or in some cases, 5,000, 10,000. We had an example yesterday of 20 or 30,000 variables in particular kinds of work. What are the data and the sensitivities of them for reuse will vary considerably between human and animal and say documentary records, but also the notions of the data, I think as we got early with John and Anna particularly, of showing all the different pieces. And that's certainly what we find in our own work. It's the objects that you're looking at, it's the protocols, it's the records, some are machine readable, some are not. And then questions of who's going to reuse those data for what purposes over what period of time. The temporal factors have not come up as much yet as one might have expected, where reusing data from yesterday is different than reusing data from 10 years or 20 years ago, when you've got very different questions, different technologies, and different software, network, and infrastructure requirements to come back to them. I think Jan's comment about churning through it quickly versus trying to manage it for long term is something you see in systems theory as well. So I think this has covered a great deal, and we should relinquish the floor to the next break and the next speakers. Thank you, and a virtual applause to everyone for a brilliant panel. Thank you again.